In the first lecture, you will remember we were dealing with man, seeking to come to terms with this most refractory starting point of all the elements in the process of Christian discipline. We said that one could not possibly find any rules or regulations, any technique or shortcut by which man could achieve his Christian stature in relationship with God if he avoided those changes, that travail, the peculiar conversion of his own life to a spiritual dimension. In the second lecture, you remember, we turned from man to God and suggested that this was not because man came first in any sense, but rather that sometimes we did try to escape from the embarrassment of ourselves and thereby fall on evil days in seeking God. God, we said then, was prior to man, and if it were not for God's goodness, his grace, and his continual creation, there would be no meaning whatsoever either to our life or to our efforts to achieve a satisfactory relationship with him. So that now that we have dealt somewhat with man himself and with God, I should like to turn this evening to the relationship of God and man. That peculiar, stubborn, difficult relationship, which we sometimes have in great clarity, but which, being human, we lose very quickly, and sometimes with painful abruptness. One of the reasons I suspect that this relationship of God and man for us seems to be clouded by so many questions is just that we have failed in our time to be able to recognize the great saints. In fact, one might put it this way: we have respect in our time for almost any kind of a person except a saint. In the 18th century, the kind of man that was admired was a man of reason and of bold skepticism. In the 19th century, the man that was admired was a captain of industry or a man of science. In the 20th century, the great admiration of our public opinion goes to him who is the most comfortably fixed. And this elevation of comfort as a way of life is by far the most deleterious in respect to sainthood. Saints are not grown in comfortable circumstances. So that in our day, with our tremendous and avaricious greed for comfort, and with our peculiar leveling down of all the classes of the world so that we believe that everybody is better off if he's just an average sort of person, in our tremendous democratic enthusiasm, we have erased from the imagination of our time that peculiar aristocracy which bespeaks sainthood in the realm of religion. In fact, it is an interesting thing that in Protestantism we seem to be rebellious against any notion of saintliness. We have gotten rid of the medieval saints, I suspect, we feel, and therefore we don't want to have anything more to do with these people who have such strange psychological visions and get peculiarly private messages from God. and who restrict their activities to monasteries or to wilderness places. We have a feeling that a Christian in our time must be just an average sort of person, and that he must live the same kind of lives we live, and be really a hail fellow, well met, congenial in all the circumstances of our social world. In other words, we have eradicated the very point at which the relationship of God and man becomes concrete and living in a singular person who, by reason of his discipline, has been able to achieve in the realm of religion what a great scientist would achieve in the realm of science by the same kind of devotion. Only when a man finds God, and by persistence and patience and the exercise of his imagination, clings to God in all the varied circumstances of this world, does he really become a man. So that in a sense, a saint is all that a man can possibly be. He is man perfected. He is the one in whom all the opposites of this world are united. Flesh and spirit. Mind and heart. Faith and doubt. Yes, and doubt. Tragedy and redemption of that tragedy. Darkness of mystery and the light of clear understanding. The simplicity of a child, the subtlety of a genius. All these things, not merely thrown together as they are in the normal person, but welded together out of the deep consuming fire of a man's inner disciplines, so that here the glow and the light burns at its most intense pitch. This is the saint. And this is where we see the relationship of God and man most clearly. And yet, we must confess that for our times, we have so revolted against, let us say, peculiarly medieval or ancient notions of sainthood, that we now in our time do not know how to identify a saint. We do not know the man who has been able to take this frightening, disintegrating world of the 20th century and bind it together in the quietness of his soul and without any publicity and without any pretentiousness, and so create within himself that extraordinary intensity of tension and of contradictions bound together in one harmonious living spirit. This would be to recognize a new kind of saint in our time. Now it is this man who has real relationship with all the different aspects of human existence, from the deepest depths to the highest heights, who has not turned his back on science, or disdained art, or held philosophy in contempt, or looked at this tremendously blurred and confusing world in which we live and denied it its reality, but a man who has stood in the middle of such a world with all its terrifying opposites and all its terrible possibilities, and has realistically and by tremendous imaginative grasp embraced all of it and bound it together. It is in this man that one gets some semblance of what one might mean by prayer. For it is of prayer that I want to speak tonight. Not in the sense that one can talk of prayer as though it were merely the sum total of prayers in the plural. Not as if it were merely man's talkative monologue in sacred places. I am thinking now of prayer as that broad, deep, and creative relationship which man and God have with one another, in which the spoken dialogue is but the smallest part and portion. And in order to do that, I should like to suggest to you that we must ask, first of all, the question as to the kind of a world in which prayer is possible. Prayer becomes possible in any world where everything, literally everything, from the farthest corner to the inmost center, is completely and intricately woven together so that you cannot touch any one portion of the universe without there occurring a long series of infinite shocks and reverberations like rings in a pool when a stone is thrown into it. And however minute and subtle these waves are, the entire universe is affected. This is not particularly a resource of religious thinkers. A man like Alfred North Whitehead has elevated this to the doctrine of what he calls the prehension of all things. Everything being bound in with every other thing, so that when you and I live by denials or by anger or by love, by any activity of any sort whatsoever, we are changing the universe and changing it sometimes at much greater distances than we have any idea. I presume that the kind of anger and hostility and bitterness and cynicism and hatred which you and I pile up within our souls and put down underneath the hatches so our neighbors will not see it, and sometimes let loose against our loved ones who will forgive us. This kind of anger and hostility and bitterness and vengeance which we keep under the hatches until it accumulates so much that personally we dare not exhibit it, but some far-off event in some other land may explode, and then all this hidden hostility rises, and it is expressed patriotically in the defense of our own land against the enemy. It is the far-off wars that feed on your and my inner hostility and anger and sin. It is true, it seems to me, that here at the very center of our world there is this kind of a feeling of interwovenness and interrelatedness, so that we cannot do anything but that we do put our finger on and move the world in one direction or another. And this is prayer. You are in communion with the universe. And no matter what you try to do to get out of communion, even your most stubborn denial and your most deliberate hostility and your most violent reaction still holds you with iron bands, so that even in these things you change the world. Not for the good, to be sure, but your prayers of evil are answered just as completely as your prayers of goodness. So that in one sense, those people who are trying to do something to the universe really need not try so hard, because no matter how you live and what you do, the changes occur. And you do not need to ask for a universe more responsive than it is. If it were more responsive, it might respond more to our evil than it does. And it were well for everyone that there's a certain stubbornness about things as they are, and that they do not answer quite so glibly to our selfish demands. No, this is a universe in which the responsiveness of all things makes it possible for us to talk about prayer as that relationship between ourselves and the whole destiny of the universe. It is, as Galileo once said, that God tends to you, responds to you, just as the sun tends to a bunch of grapes as if it were the only bunch of grapes in the world and ripens them. So God responds to you, because it's this kind of a universe. Look at it one other way. The thing which is most responsive is not a stone, but a plant. But a plant is not as responsive as a dog, and a dog is not as responsive as a man or a woman, so that the higher we go in the plane of life, the more responsiveness we get. And this responsiveness in man is a responsiveness not only to what he sees in the world, not only to the farthest sun and stars, but it is also a responsiveness to the things he does not see. Visions of beauty, dreams of goodness, guesses of truth, hypotheses and hopes. And these are all parts of the responsiveness. But if man is so responsive to the whole of things, how much more is God responsive? So that it is not a question of asking, does God answer prayer? God is more responsive to us than man. And his responsiveness is immediate, for he is closer to us than our fellows. There is a famous poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, which I should like to read to you because it exemplifies this closeness of God and puts very plainly in our mind how erroneous we are when we try to reach God by going out into the far distances of the sky and by some kind of radar or radio reach beyond the stars to the dwelling place of God. This spatial heresy robs us of the fact that God is nearer to us than we are to ourselves. You, neighbor God, says Rilke, it sometimes seems in the night that I would rouse you with loud knocking. I do so only because I seldom hear you breathe. I know you are alone. And should you need a drink, no one is there to reach it to you, groping in the dark. But I hearken, and give me but a sign, for I am quite near. And then there comes the answer from God. Between us there is but a narrow wall. And by sheer chance, for it would take merely a call from your lips or from mine to break it down, and that all noiselessly, the wall is builded of your images. They stand before you, hiding you like names. And when the light within me blazes high, that in my inmost soul I know you by, the radiance is squandered on their frames. It is this God who is immediately near, under our existence, without whom we could not live.
It is this God who is nearer to me than I to myself, who has the capacity to respond so much more than a man responds, or an animal, or a plant, or a stone. That makes possible prayer in its widest dimension. Now, in this relationship of prayer between God and man, one might easily call it love, if that word had not been used so much in the past for so many things. But it is the relationship through which we breach the limits of our finite selves. It is by prayer, by communion, by the relationship with God that we finally discover that life to which we were born and through which we are fulfilled. There is an ancient dream told by Martin Buber which illustrates this relationship perfectly. It has occurred to him 3 or 4 times in his life, and he has become somewhat fascinated by it. At the beginning of the dream, there seems to have been some animal that clutched his arm and tore the flesh. And this passes very quickly. And then, as suddenly, he finds himself standing in a great open space, looking across all the prairies and the plains and continents of the world, as if it were a great cell or cave. And as he looks, he feels within himself this great cry coming from his heart, at first very timidly, and then much more boldly, and then carrying in all its sound the anguish and the ecstasy of his entire life, the mystery of his birth, the long, painful climbing of his childhood, the experiences of his manhood and maturity. And then this great cry increases until he feels as if his throat would break, as if his heart would stop beating. And then it ceases. And for a moment, his heart does stop as he listens to this cry going through the world. And then, out of the silence, there comes the same cry, it would seem, and yet not the same. A cry just as timid and as small from somewhere out in the mysterious world in which this cry has now gone. Answering him, replying, a different cry, now taking up all the sounds of creation, all the wonders and mysteries of history. And out of this coming back until the soul of this dreamer is satisfied. This is what you and I are doing in praying. We're taking everything that comes to us, this anguish of torn flesh, this mortality of our human living, this fading and dimming, this sickness and anguish, this doubt and skepticism, all the pain of our human life. This is the thing that draws us into the anguish of communion, this hunger, this need, this pain that is like loneliness, unassuaged. And then we utter our cry. I do not know how you utter yours. I know how Michelangelo uttered his, in great paintings or sculptures. I know how Galileo uttered his, in thinking out the laws of nature. I know how Phidias and Praxiteles and others thought theirs in crafts and skills. Musicians, poets, philosophers, all crying out somehow by the skill of their hands or the insight of their minds or the anguish of vision in the saint's heart, but each one in his own way asking the world in this prayer of anguish in which a whole man's life is gathered up and expressed and articulated. This is a man's prayer, not the words he utters in church, not the little phrases he has learned. These are but the almost accidental and secondary features of that primary prayer which binds him in a living relationship in the concrete experiences of life with the inescapable and responsively living God. This is a man's prayer. And if a man can pray in this sense, that his work is done to the glory of God, or that his thoughts are thought deeply and exaltedly enough to touch the hem of God's mystery, if his vision of beauty becomes so holy that he will not compromise it or sell it in the marketplaces of men, if this deep integrity of his soul is so goodly that he will not corrupt it for any price, then this man prays in the great manner. Then he becomes a saint, as Dante was a saint and St. Francis of Assisi was a saint. Then he becomes a man who takes his whole life and draws it together in preparation for prayer. And there is no prayer, you see. There is nothing with which you can pray until somehow you reach out and get all your life in one bundle, the good and the bad in it, the high and holy and the deep and base, the faith which you have, but also the doubts that you must have if you have any faith. And this wide, broken, contradictory, perplexing, painful human existence, which you call yourself, once you've gotten this together, then you have something to pray with. You have all the sanctities of your life, the sanctities of birth, and the sanctity of that future which is called death, and the sanctity of that love which allowed you to breach the limits of your lonely individuality, and the sanctity of little children, and the sanctity of visions of beauty which you must have no matter how otherwise poor a soul you may be, and those deep insights into truth without which no man goes through life. All these things, all the Gethsemanes and the Calvaries, all the Canas and the Galilees, all these things that fill your days and life to crowding, these are the materials. And then you stand in the presence of this most responsive of all beings, namely the living God, and this prayer utters itself. The sanctities are celebrated, the joys and ecstasies of your experience rush in to make obeisance before that glory which is their very creator. And your sins, your darkness, your pettiness, your meanness, your violence, your anger, yes, this is also there. And this is why you repent. Because the glory of God, you see, is not something that is thought about. The glory of God is that which has permeated your living the living texture of your days, the flesh and the mind and the spirit of your own self, and as it permeates it, then these things are uttered so that on your knees you find God closer than breathing or hands or feet. And to see his holiness is good when you see it in your own life, manifesting itself in birth and love and friendship and reverence and mystery and kindness in 1,000 manifestations. That glory of God is so good when you see his holiness in your life. And it is so hard to see when alongside that holiness you see your own baseness and pettiness and perversity and denials and violence. And this is why alongside of one another you will have joy and you will have sorrow. You have exaltation and you have humility. And the two things you can't separate. This is prayer. There will come moments when you will want to say something in a prayer life, in a life which has relationships with God at every level and in all kinds of places. And these spoken prayers are also good. For these are something like the flower from the plant that grows in the darkness of the ground of our common days. But never suspect that you can have the flower without the plant or the ground. It's because you have to work hard at some drudgery and make the glory come out of it. It's because as human creatures, each single soul must somehow be an artist and take the refractory materials of the world and make something beautiful out of it. It's because you were sent into the world as Christ came into the world to be ambassadors of reconciliation, to take the opposites and the contradictions of sickness and of health, of doubt and of faith, and to pull them together so that there is meaning and glory in this common struggle. Then at that point, you live in the prayer, and your voice will come through this kind of a life and blossom into all kinds of spoken prayers. To begin with, I suspect that one of the finest prayers that can be uttered is the prayer of waiting. Just waiting. No words. The soul is growing as a plant grows, and it isn't time for it to flower into words. And to make words at the wrong time is to stick a dead paper flower on a living plant. We were wiser if we would pray less often, and when we prayed with words, made them the living flowers of deep and abiding vitalities in our own souls. There comes times when we have prayed too much, too long, too tritely, and then we ought to go back to the wilderness. Say nothing. Enter the silence and wait. Wait on the Lord. Wait on the Lord and be of good cheer. This waiting is also praying. Not only waiting, but inward seeing also is praying. To so see inwardly, to contemplate those things which otherwise are invisible, to hold them in the mind's eye, the beauty and the glory of God, the meekness and humility of Jesus Christ, the wonder of the world, to hold them quietly, patiently,
to let the splendor fall down like golden rain upon our hearts, to be quiet, to soak it up, to keep our attention on it. Contemplation is not looking at organ pipes in the church. Contemplation is turning the sight inward and giving one's whole existence to that which comes from the glory of God, until the glory of God and one's existence are bound together and melt as if they were one. We do not know how to contemplate very much in the 20th century. We prefer to be busy about things. The art of contemplation doesn't rise very quickly from people who have been busy with the Sunday morning newspaper before they come to church, or whose lives are fatigued by radio and television and committee meetings. We have mighty poor ground for the growing of these arts of the contemplative life, where a man could do what that old French peasant did when his priest asked him what he did so many hours on his knees before the altar, and the old man said, "I just look at him, and he looks at me." This is contemplation. And without this rich, dense, compacted inwardness, I fear our prayers will be just as thin as the haste with which we live our outer lives. Moreover, there is not only this prayer of waiting and the prayer of seeing inwardly, whereby we hold within our mind's imagination and participate in the activities, for instance, of the life of Jesus, imitating imaginatively, participating with feeling those things through which he passed. But there is also the prayer of hearing. Hearing. Can you pray listening to the 23rd Psalm? You do not have to repeat it. You know it by heart. The Lord is my shepherd. Do not run to the next verse. Wait a while. Listen to it again and again, and let it soak down, all the way down. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. It isn't speed that counts in the Spirit. It is depth and waiting and giving the seed a chance to get rooted and to grow, to be reflected upon, to be imaginatively elaborated, until at last it's not as if you were thinking about the 23rd Psalm at all. It's as if the 23rd Psalm had vanished and you saw your own life spread out before you, and his ministry at every turn of the road. And then your contemplation, your participation, your inward richness is complete, and you've made an offering to God, and God is in the offering. It is in something of this kind of an experience that one might say that true prayer is the conversion of a man to God. It is the daily conversion of a man to God. It is prayer only when a man takes what he is, everything he is, good and bad, and converts it, transforms it, changes it so that it befits the glory of God. And then he himself has become a new kind of creature, a man not of space and time, not of a class, or of a race, or of a nation, or of a party. He becomes then a man like Christ. A man like Christ, who stands above all nations, all divisions, all barriers, all hatred, and reconciles in himself, and by the pain of his own crucifixion, all the hatred and hostility of those whom he knows. To become that kind of a man means that you have to give everything you are to the whole life you live, that God, who is in life and not outside of life, can at last do with you what he intended you to be in the first place. Christopher Fry has a great and grand play of 4 soldiers who fall asleep in church, having been billeted there during the war. And as they sleep, they find themselves reenacting the experiences of Adam and of Cain and Abel and of David and Absalom and of Abraham and Isaac. Reenacting those ancient experiences. You and I pray best when we put ourselves into this great eternal kingdom of God and know that also we are Adam because we are man. We also are Cain and Abel, destroyer and destroyed. We are Abraham and Isaac, the sacrificer and the sacrificed. We are David and Absalom, the one who trusts and the one who is betrayed and the betrayer. Life is all one, and God is integral with it. And every man prays and changes the world, not according to the words he utters, but according to the work he does and the nature of the relationship he has with reality and the breadth of the responsiveness he elicits from that creation which God made, that he might enter into the fullness of that abundant life which is known only in Christ Jesus. The grace of God, said Charles Peggy, is very insidious. If it doesn't come straight, it comes bent. If it doesn't come bent, it comes broken. If it doesn't come from above, it comes from within. If it doesn't come from within, it comes from without. If it doesn't come in a great storm, it comes like a trickle of water oozing under a Loire dike. The goodness of God is waiting all around you, but you cannot give it only a part of your attention or a piece of your life. It asks for everything. And once you give it everything, it buoys you up like the water of the sea, where once you take your foot off the bottom, you find yourself afloat over fathoms of mystery, but secure in the hand of God.